My name is Ted. What's going to happen today is we're going to talk about what consent is, talk about the consent process, and then how to integrate objection. The reason consent is important to me is because it's basically the pillar of everything. It's the foundation of everything in this governance system because we don't want a coercive system. We want to make sure that people have a chance to say no to things. Um, and um, Really, by consent, you can change anything in the system, basically. So, for example, you can consent to voting. You can consent to having an autocratic leader for whatever, 5 hours, 3 weeks, 6 years. What do I know? In theory, although I wouldn't recommend it to have an autocratic leader for 6 months, for 6 years, in theory, that is compatible, with sociocracy. If you have good reasons to do it, maybe that's what you do. But you would have to do it by consent. And you can't just have one person deciding that they're it. Okay? So that's why consent is basically the foundation to me. Another thing about the way I've been setting it up is just sort of consent is what everything revolves around. The consent process is basically important because we need the skills to get there and to know when we have consent. The clarity and the explicitness is important. And then the other one is if you don't know how to deal with objections, consent isn't worth anything. If nobody can say no, then yes is not a yes. So that's why having skills around objections is the key in the whole picture. So I'm focusing on the absolute necessary here. So I'm not talking about organizational structure. I'm not really talking about meeting format. Any of those, there's more where this comes from. And yet, I'm focusing on what you need to basically ship this right away, just the consent piece. In some versions of SOS in the UK, for example, that I've seen, you have a choice of the decision-making method. That's one of the 2% that doesn't overlap because that's something I wouldn't choose to do, but I respect that that's how some people do it. For me, consent is the foundation. So what is consent? And I'm gonna give you the definition first. The idea of consent is that if there is a proposal, then you would say no to the proposal, you would object to the proposal if you see any way in which the proposal harms what the group signed up to do, which is called mandate and XR, aim and sociocracy. So you can't do your work if this proposal passes because it creates some issue downstream. If you don't have an objection, that means you consent. And you might consent because you love it. You say, that's exactly what I wanted. Or you consent because you say, doesn't make any big difference to me. Yeah, sure, we can do it. No reason not to. The good thing about consent compared to other models that shoot more for people's preference, for example, if you ask, do you agree, or is that what you want, or what is it that you want, or what would you rather have, kind of questions, then you prompt people to soul search what their preference is. And in consent, I always say a little, that's phrased provocatively. I'm going to say it provocatively. We don't really care what you like or what you don't like. What we care about is, do you think it serves the aim? Do you think the group can do what they signed up to do with this proposal? If yes, great, consent. If no, please let us know why not. So that's the basic setup. And there's many ways of talking about this. For example, you can say range of tolerance is what you can live with, what you can work with, what you're willing to accept, and so on. All those are different ways of saying the same thing. What counts is that people have somewhat of a concept of this difference. And I use this in natural language quite a bit, for example. I sometimes ask my kids, not what do you want for dinner? I ask them, is there a reason not to have this and that? So I turn the question around into to provoke objections and not so much go into what would be the ideal for you. Okay, so that's just a little bit of a mental flip that has quite some big effect, actually. I'm going to talk some about the mindset shifts around that too. So one of the mindset is, I've already alluded to that, but let me elaborate. So more important than your own opinions is, do you think the purpose, aim, mandate, whatever you call it, um, is sort of negatively impacted by a proposal? That's the question on the table for decision making. And the ideas that we remind people of the shared purpose instead of going into, I like this, I like that kind of thinking. Um, I actually personally find this very liberating, that I don't even have to have an opinion. I find it extremely, not comforting. What's the word? It's almost like I'm getting a break from having to have an opinion. But I just have to, check. Do I see any red flag? No. Okay, let's move ahead. So that is the mindset where consent lives. Another one is, you don't have to convince others to believe what you believe, right? Because if I don't have to get other people to think that my idea is the best idea, I just have to find with them whether there's any place of where it creates harm or might create harm, then we're good. So, the whole convincing and, convincing, persuasion, divisiveness, and so on just doesn't apply anymore. Because, and I'm going to reiterate that a few times, we're on the same page already because we have the shared aim, the shared purpose, mandate, whatever, that brings us into this circle, into this team. Anything that is in support of that, we're going to say yes to. Anything that harms that, we're going to say no to and object to, and then we work out how to improve it. So we're not against each other at all, because given that we're on the same team, I assume we all subscribe to the same purpose. So there's no problem. We're on the same team all the time, no matter what happens. So that's a really helpful thing to remember. It actually changes the energy quite a bit. Also, because you enter the discussion um, knowing that the end will be consent. So you're not going to say things that are, driving, like it's driving a wedge between people. That doesn't make any sense, because you're never going to get to consent with that kind of behavior. So it fosters seeing what we share, and it fosters, coming to some sort of synergy, merging of ideas, just by virtue of consent is at the end and everybody knows it. Obviously, if a group is new to it and so on, you might still fall into behaviors like that, but over time people learn. That's what happens. So one little thing here. This is actually a graphic from a book that we published, in case you want to see a lot more of this kind. So the idea is that these are the concentric circles that I showed with preference and range of tolerance, and that if we ask what do we all want, then we're going to work with a very small overlap of what our preferences are. While if we work with what are we all willing to work with, then we have a large overlap. This is obviously just a sort of symbolic representation of having more to work with, but that's the idea. Other mindset thing. Since we have more to work with, if we make decisions, if we make it easier to make decisions, if we sort of lower the threshold just enough that we, kick into action with an objection, but move forward if there's no objection, then we're going to make more decisions over time. And the idea is that with this good enough for now kind of thinking, we're going to make a decision. We're making a plan, carrying it, like we're making a decision on a plan, we carry it out, we evaluate what happened. And since it was easy to do that, we're going to do it many times. And we might not come to the perfect plan the first round, but we're getting closer every time. So instead of discussing for 5 months what the perfect plan is, let's discuss it for 1 month, or, even shorter, but that's sort of just a little numbers game here. Let's discuss it for 1 month, make a decision, put it into practice, learn what happens in the second month, adjust it. During the third month, we adjust it even more. And then we've had, 4 cycles of making a decision and adjusting it. We're going to get to a better result at the end, and it's going to be informed by reality and not just by hypothetical thinking. That's the idea of good enough for now. That is the mindset, the rapid prototyping mindset that is driving that. Let's just get to a decision and learn from it. Because in the end, none of us can really predict what's going to happen. The world has become so complex. If we're honest, we can't really predict it. So let's just move and learn from that. So that was part one, sort of the conceptual thinking of consent. Now we're going to the process. So this is basically, meeting facilitation kind of stuff, which is, by the way, one of my favorite topics. Meeting facilitation is where I really feel at home. So the way we do consent processes is we sort of build on these steps. The first step, if there's a proposal on the table that needs a decision, is making sure everybody understands the proposal. We're not moving forward if people don't understand it, because as I'm sure we've all experienced, it's easy to have an opinion about something that turns out to be based on a misconception about what the proposal was. Might not happen as much in meetings. It happens there too. Happens a lot in interpersonal communication, when, I don't know, somebody proposes something and the other one is up in arms right away, but turns out they actually misunderstood each other. So that's why the idea is, let's understand each other first. Like, go slow in the beginning, understand each other first. Then what we typically do, and I'm going to talk more about what that looks like, is we give everybody a chance to respond. So what do you think about the proposal? Don't make it long, but just, so that everybody has been heard at least once on this decision. And then we go to consent. And while in the reactions, you can say whatever you want. For consent, there are exactly two options. You consent or you object. Nothing in between. And I'm aware that people's opinions and feelings and whatever, sense of confidence in the proposal, are gradual. But the outcome of whether we move forward or whether we work, whether the proposal needs reworking, that is a binary outcome. Either we go forward or we refine a little. So I want people to really decide where they are on that one. Either you consent or you don't. And if you consent, then, that means you actually consent. But we're going to get to sort of integrating objections and what if people mention concerns and so on. We're going to get to that. What we do a lot in Sociocracy, and I highly, highly, highly recommend it, is getting used to doing rounds. And a round is something very, very simple. And it's not rocket science, and it's not unique to Sociocracy. And yeah, one can do it, and it changes the culture quite a bit. So let's say the person with a fancy hat here, I consider this fancy, is the facilitator, and says, okay, I would like to, hear your reactions to the proposal. Then that person, the facilitator, is going to point to where the group is going to start. And let's say the point here and say, okay, let's do a round. And this person speaks, this person gives their reaction, this person, the facilitator, speaks as a circle member, and then this person speaks, and one round is over. Why do we do that? Because it's a practice of equivalence. If we say if we want to hear everybody, we actually have to hear everybody. And that's a very easy way of doing it. It also creates clarity and sort of a structure of this. It's like a dance that has a certain rhythm to it. You started a round and you just go through your rounds and everybody knows it's happening, and it becomes very flowy in a way. It also, I claim, saves time, because what happens otherwise is that, let's say there is no round and this person responds to the prompt and this person responds to that person and this person interrupts, and then that person says, why did you interrupt me? And then this person is wondering where we are right now, and this person doesn't know what we're talking about but doesn't like that this person interrupted. You get the idea? That's what meetings are like. And we spend a lot of time backtracking and not knowing where we're going and so on. It's just not worth it. So rounds tend to keep the group on track because you always know what the question on the table is. So what's this round about? Oh, it's a reaction to this and that. Okay. So you always know in every moment what you're doing. And that is in itself already very helpful. Another thing is that in rounds, one's let's say the round started here, I said, um, while this person is speaking, this person with a baseball cap knows that it's going to be, three people speaking before they even have a turn. So what people start doing over time is they're easing into just sitting back and listening, because you're not sitting on the, like, sort of, what's that called? Like, you're not sitting on your chair, about to jump up, because you know that, you have to interrupt that person to get the thing in that you want to say. That kind of behavior actually fades because it's not your turn, you're going to have a turn, so you might as well listen. And that is a big key. You actually start to listen to each other, which means people only have to say things once because they heard the first time. And that cuts out a lot of time too. I don't know if you are around people that repeat themselves all the time. They typically do that because they have had the experience of not having been heard. So one strategy is to say it all over again. So why am I talking about rounds when I really was promising to talk about consent? I think they don't necessarily go hand in hand, but consent as a decision-making method is just so much easier in a system where you have rounds, because people are heard. That means they trust the process. That means they know they're being seen and understood. And it's much easier to get to consent if we've understood and listened to each other properly in the first place. You can, in theory, use consent without rounds, but it's just easier. So why not do it? So there are different kinds of rounds. Hold on, let me show them all right away. And I'm just going to touch on that briefly, just so you get a sense of it if you have never heard of rounds. And that is, so let's say this person is still the facilitator. They can say, so this is the proposal. Let's do a clarifying questions round to make sure everybody understands. How about you start? And then that person says, oh, I think I understand everything. That person says, I think I do too. That person says, I actually have a question about paragraph number 3. And then they ask that question, and then we finish our round, and then we answer all the questions and make sure there are no new questions. So that's what a clarifying questions round looks like. You can also take a shortcut there, but I've often regretted taking shortcuts. So then a reaction round I've already described, so people would give a reaction to whatever is the question on the table. And then consent round I've already described, but I'm going to act it out for you because I find it important to really get a sort of almost visual sense of what that looks like. So as already said, the two options, consent versus object, and only those two. So let's say this person is still the facilitator and says, let's do a consent round on this proposal. And would say, how about you start? And that person says, I consent. That person says, I consent too. That person says, I have no objections, which is the same thing. That person says, I actually do have an objection. Let's say, oh, interesting. Okay, we're going to hear you when we're done. And how about you? I have no objection. And then the facilitator would go back to that person and say, so I'm curious about your objection. Notice that hold on, sorry, I'm going to skip that piece. What I did, okay, it's going to be later, but what I did is I finished the round first before I heard the objection. That's one thing that I'm going to get back to. When people are new to rounds, they often wonder, okay, you might be thinking of a group where people talk over each other. How would you ever get them to do rounds? Because sometimes people have a reaction to round and that they're saying, this is too rigid. I want to have free flow and I want to speak organically as ideas come to me. Say, that's great. There is a big downside to that. And the big downside is as soon as there is what people call sort of organic, you're also probably going to get all the behaviors that contributed to the mess that we're in. The way I look at the world, it's men will speak more often, people, higher class people are going to speak more often, extroverts are going to speak more often, maybe, people of color are going to speak less, and so on. If that's what you want, go right ahead, but I am very keen on breaking that pattern, and that's why I tend to stick to rounds. There are some mixed versions, which is starting with a round, letting people sort of go more free flow, and then ending with a round again. That can make it easier, because some people seem to lose their creativity once they're afraid that they're going to be forced to do a rigid round. So, but a few things you can say to encourage rounds or to remind people that that's what you might have committed to is this is sort of what you could say in a group that has not ever heard about rounds. I like to make sure everyone can speak without being interrupted. You know, could we hear from people one by one without interrupting each other, just really listening what everybody has to say? That's doable in any group, I would say. And then there's more refined versions. For example, this was actually a real life sentence I encountered from somebody who is an introvert and was in the middle of a meeting without rounds and then said that thing of, I have things I want to say, but I don't want to interrupt others. It's easier for me to contribute if we do rounds. Basically asking to not be put in a position where he would have had to interrupt people. Keeping rounds short and sweet helps, make it easy for people to stick to rounds. Like, you can pass if you have nothing to say, or you can time your rounds, or you can encourage people to take notes so that they don't have to interrupt each other and really speak only when it's their turn, and so on. So this can all be tweaked and improved, but this is the basic idea. Why is this not moving now? No, yes. Integrating objections. So this is the third part, and then I'm happy to stay for Q&A. But basically, this is the brain dump, and I'm doing it in a speedy way to honor people's time, because I'm also aware that some of you know that kind of stuff. So, integrating objections. As I said in the beginning, if we can say no, then the yes isn't worth much. So we have to train people to say no, and we have to encourage them to object. Because in our, mainstream sort of, the way we're conditioned in our culture is that objecting is uncomfortable. You might be looked at the person who's throwing a monkey wrench into the process. You might be looked at the naysayer, the person who, whatever, is the troublemaker. So it is already uncomfortable to object. So let's make it as easy as possible. So what I said earlier, finish the consent round. So if, you have the round where everybody's asked, do you consent or do you object? One person objects, just continue. And that I say, and that's important to me, because I want people to know that objections are part of the game. It's not that all of a sudden everybody's like, oh, there was an objection, what do we do now? Everything stops. No, that's not at all the case. Just go, okay, thank you, interesting, let's continue. Like, you have to be confident about that. Otherwise, you're gonna, you're gonna give the impression that objecting is a big thing, and that might discourage people from objecting. So that's why just keeping you cool and continuing it also buys you time, in case you as a facilitator need to sort of have a moment of, there's gonna be an objection, what do I do now? Then, buy yourself some time and finish the round. So my whole point about objecting is, the better you're at integrating objections, the easier it will be for people to object. The more information you will get from people about what they think is going to work and is not going to work. So your decisions are going to be more realistic. You're going to have people who really mean what they say yes to. So you're going to have more buy-in to the decision. And overall, if you are good at integrating objection and harvesting people's wisdom in what they bring in an objection, the more they're going to trust that their voice really matters. So you can really only win here. I see absolutely no downside as being, if you being good at integrating objections is always a good thing. And remember, the more information we have, the better we can evaluate the first time. And if we do, if we evaluate what we did, on every step on the way, we're going to have more information. So overall, if you're good at integrating objections, you're going to reach your aim mandate, purpose better and faster. What's not to like about that? The other one is, I've already alluded to that earlier, but it is really key. You can only object if you see that there is a negative impact on the group's shared purpose, aim, mandate. So that means you have somebody in the room who works alongside with you, wants the same thing, and thinks there's a problem. There's absolutely no reason I can think of why you wouldn't want to hear what they see, because they might have a crucial piece of information that you're not seeing. The other one is that, purpose aside, in my world, everybody has the same needs, like, need for belonging or respect or being heard or being known and all of those. So that is something that we share too. So even on that basis, it makes a lot of sense to hear each other and make sure that everybody's needs are considered. So all of that to say is, focus on what you share and not so much on what divides you, because you share a lot. Just by virtue of being in the same team, you share the most key thing in that moment. And that is care for the group, the people in the group, and the purpose of the group. So start there, and on your mind, sort of hold that as the most core thing. Another thing in that thinking is that if everybody has basically the same needs and the same, and the circle as such has the need of wanting to achieve its aim, then something that somebody says that rises to the level of an objection is something that any of us could have seen. So it's not unique to the person who objects. So really the way I look at it is, everybody is just a sensor for what's bubbling up anyway. And I've seen numerous examples actually where somebody had an objection, then we do a reaction round, and just by having been heard well, the original objector drops their objection. And then other people say, no, hold on, you actually raised something that is super important. No, the objection stays in place. We want to address this. That story is to show you that one person might bring it up, but really the circle holds the ownership of the objection. So in my world, objections are not owned by people, and I even hesitate to say a word like objector. To me, it's the person, basically giving birth to the objection, if you want to use it like that. But it's not something about them that makes them the objector. It's really about the piece of information that they bring. That's the relevant thing, not so much the person. Anyway, that's a little MVC thing that I'm actually not going to go into right now. So that is also, by the way, since the objections are owned by the circle, not by the objector, I never put the constraint on a group that the objector can only object if they have a better idea. I would never do that, because that is incompatible with how I think about it. I want people to be free to object and trust the wisdom of the group to figure something out. But it's not their responsibility to fix it. They've done their duty by raising it. So if there is an objection, what I do is first make sure that we understand the objection. So hold on, actually, people are probably looking at that because people are always drawn to the more visual aspect of it. So we we make sure everybody understands the proposal, we do a quick reaction round and so on, and then we go into the consent round, and we would be ready to ship whatever we're doing if everybody consents. If there's an objection, we do just an extra loop to improve it a little bit. So this is the loop. And the first step is to understand. So what's really going on? Do you really have a sense that you understand the objection? Did you really grasp what it's about? Because people might object and not really have it worded properly yet. They might make their way there, or they might just say, I'm just, concerned about it, but I can't quite put my finger on it. And I'm not saying to go down every rabbit hole, and every feeling that people might have. But if somebody you trust has a gut feeling about something being, flawed in this, it might be worth listening. So really make sure you understand what the essence is of the objection. Then what is a good idea is to do a round on, okay, so where are we at with this? What do people think? What could we do? You might even have two rounds if it's a big deal, like one where you just sort of do a reaction round to the objection and then a round on what do you think we should do? What I like as a prompt here in that reaction round is to remind people that what it's all about is the aim, purpose, mandate. Because that's, again, what everything is centered around, and it makes sense in that moment to remind people of that. Because they might have their own personal reaction to the objection, to their disappointment that it didn't go through, or however the objector phrased it or whatever. So they will have their own thing going on. So make it easy for them to sort of see the higher ground of what's the shared purpose by reminding them. So for example, so now we heard this objection. How are you doing with this objection in relationship to the circle's aim? What do you do with that? I also am not buying into testing objections. I know that's a thing, and I'm not buying into it because I'm afraid it turns it into a power game of what objection is being permitted and declared valid and which one isn't. I'd rather listen to people. So this whole testing game is just not something I do. And then from here, there will be ideas, and they're always good ideas. So I trust that. There will be a new proposal that then we send back into the consent process. Hold on, sorry. I see a comment in the chat, but I somehow can't pull it out. I'm almost done though, so I'm going to look at the chat at the end. So if there is an objection, we have several options. One is you just change the proposal, whatever it takes. There could be all kinds of examples. If green doesn't work, let's do blue, whatever makes sense at the moment. There's just too many options to even think about that. And groups are typically good about this one, so I'm not concerned about that. The other two are more important. One is shorten the term. In Sociocracy, what's typically done is that every decision has a term for how long it's sort of in effect. And then, in theory, it goes out of effect to, what is that? So loses its, no, what's the English way of saying this? So it's not in effect anymore unless you confirm it again. You say, no, this, you have to sort of reconsent to it. And typically review it a little while you're at it. So if you make the term very short, you will be able to get people to consent to things that they might be concerned about just by shortening the term, making the term short enough that they're willing to say yes and try it out. Because remember, in this little sort of swirly kind of arrow that I showed, we want to get to a position where we make more decisions and we can adjust along the way. So having a short term doesn't harm at all. It actually contributes to earlier learning because you're going to be forced to evaluate earlier. So that's great. Nobody loses anything in shortening the term. The only thing you lose is that you would have to look at it earlier, and that is the cost is meeting time. But that's okay. Might be worth it. So if somebody is not willing to consent to something because they are worried about something that might happen, you can say, all right, are you willing to try it out for 2 months? 2 months is too long? 4 weeks. And I've resolved many objections like that. And honestly, some of them, turned out to be very valid, and we were all glad that we shortened the term and caught it early. Some of them turned out to not be a problem at all, And then we just looked at the proposal and consented again. No big deal. So shortening the term buys you time and buys you forward motion with hardly any cost. And I think it's highly, highly underused. So shortening the term is my favorite by far. I've even integrated objections, to be honest, that I haven't even fully understood, because it's so convenient to just go like, okay, wow, that's an interesting objection. I don't quite get it. But are you willing to do it for 2 months? That's basically a way forward. The other one is measuring the concern. So if somebody is concerned about one aspect of the proposal, for example, let's do a super simple example. Somebody wants to change the color scheme on the website and wants to turn the donate button from blue into red. And somebody says, oh, I read the study once that people, click on green donate button more often than on red ones. So I'm concerned about red, and I'm worried that our donation numbers will drop. Say, okay, let's make it red and measure for a week what happens with our donations. If we see a drop, we would have to define what drop would be, and for how long. If it drops, we're going to change it back. So what's the longest you're willing to give us to gather data that you would consider safe? The cool thing about this, and you can combine them, right? You would shorten the term alongside with that. The cool thing about this is, if somebody is worried about something and you end up measuring whether they're right, first of all, you put them into a position of having to base their fear and their concern in reality. They have to give you a metric that you can work with. And the other one is, it's super not confirming, what's the word? Affirming for the person raising the concern, because you're actually doing the work of looking at whether what they're saying might be true. So again, it's a win-win, because you learn something and they might well be right, about the donate button color. They might be right, and then you'd catch it early. The objector is super happy because you took them seriously and you've moved forward and learned more information in the process. So that's the kind of situation I want to go to. I want to mention one thing, because fear-based objections are the trickiest, I find. So by fear-based objections, I mean objections that sound like, yeah, I don't know, just, I don't know if people are going to get it. I don't know whether people are going to feel about that. Let's say you change the membership fee. Yeah, I don't know what's, then people sort of tiptoe around it, but you have nothing to work with reading, because they're not saying, I'm worried that membership rates are going to drop by 5%. That's not sort of, people stay in the vague and you can't really pin them down. And then it's a good idea to pin them down, as I said, give it some sense of reality, shorten the term, measure what's going on, and try to move forward. And if you do it gracefully, without sort of having I don't believe you written on your forehead, then it's probably going to go over pretty well. There's more, as I said, from where this came from. There's all kinds of options that you have. There's a book that describes everything. We have all kinds of ideas you can do. If you want to just learn more about where this all comes from, I highly recommend this. It's a set of interactive videos where you can click around a little and sort of be led through everything that is in Sociocracy beyond consent within something like 30-ish minutes, maybe 35 or 40, something like that. So I'm going to stop. Oh, and if you want to learn with the group, some people in this room have done this. It's a set of videos that lead a group through a process. So you can look at that. This is just available on the website. You're welcome to donate at the end, and this is completely free. Always welcome to donate, but these are just accessible.